The beginning of the Western Desert Campaign in June 1940 opens up the North African theater to the war, and with it, some unique challenges for both sides. Welcome to a World War II in real-time special episode. I'm Indy Neidell. Okay, so let's start off with conditions the opposing forces will be facing in North Africa. There are two very general variations of the desert in this theater. One is the Nile Valley and its oases where much of the Egyptian population lived. The other is the Great Sand Sea, a huge region of primarily sand dunes stretching across the border of Egypt and Libya. The first is pretty easy to cross in motorized vehicles. The sand dunes, not so much. They're nearly impassable. In Egypt, the oases are separated by sand depressions and stony ridges. In Libya, it's mostly stony ground with the odd ridge. Sand and dust are constant challenges for both Allied and Axis forces. Particles not only affect the comfort of soldiers, but also wreak havoc on their equipment. The average lifetime of a Volkswagen engine should usually be 50 to 70,000 kilometers. In the desert, it's only around 12 to 14,000. Sandstorms also pose a big test, obscuring visibility for both ground and aerial forces and completely altering the land's topography. On the surface of the sand, extreme temperature creates a host of difficulties for the fighting armies. It regularly reaches 40 degrees Celsius in the shade, and temperatures inside tanks can climb even higher. The cockpits of aircraft, too, can become greenhouses, often making the metal equipment inside too hot to touch. In the summer months, there are reports of midday heat reaching as high as 60 degrees Celsius. Such extreme heat brings further visibility issues, with heat haze blurring the horizon, so it's nearly impossible to tell an approaching vehicle from a destroyed one further than a kilometer away. So, those are the conditions. Now, how did the Allied and Axis armies deal with it? Well, it actually forces both of them to make some pretty interesting innovations. On January 1st, 1941, a team of camoufleurs arrived in the desert to help the British Army concealing their movements from the enemy. The team is comprised of filmmaker Geoffrey Barkas and artists John Hutton and Blair Hughes Stanton. They are later joined by artist Stephen Sykes, scientist Dr. Hugh Cott, and magician Jasper Maskelyne. Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command, Archie Wavell, will explain the problem his soldiers are facing in a report. Possibly because the British man is normally simple and straightforward, more probably because our military training is stereotyped and unimaginative, deception of the enemy does not seem to come naturally to us. Hence, we are apt to suffer in the field through lack of guile and fall too easily into the enemy's traps and to miss opportunities of setting traps of our own. The new deception team is here to fix this. For starters, they replace the existing British greens and browns with more soft hues of pinks, yellows, and greens to better conceal them in the desert. But Barkas also realizes there's only so much you can do in the vast expanse of desert to hide your men and material. He decides instead that misdirection is the way to go. The camoufleurs bring in decoys and dummies to fool enemy aerial observers. Maskelyne the magician even creates a whole dummy airfield, as well as stage pieces which give the effect of bomb damage on real airfields to fool reconnaissance aircraft. Erwin Rommel, commander of the German Afrika Korps, also makes use of deception. Now, he regularly creates huge dust clouds in the desert to give the false impression of marching troop columns. He'll write of the success of this in his diary, detailing one instance in April 1941 when we ran into the rear of a British outpost area without knowing it. Although we only had 3 vehicles, of which only one was fitted with a machine gun, we drove up to the enemy at high speed while raising a great deal of dust. This apparently made the Englishmen nervous, and they evacuated their positions in great haste, leaving weapons and material behind. He also uses this tactic again in his offensive on Tobruk. Again, he details in his diary how. The Brescia and Trento divisions were supposed to attack Tobruk from the west and to raise a great deal of dust in the process in order to deceive and pin down the enemy. During this time, the main attack group was supposed to swing around south of Tobruk in a wide arc through the desert and attack from the southeast. The dust which was thrown up deceived the enemy so thoroughly that he guessed the attack would come from the west and paid no attention to the enveloping movement. Rommel's use of sand and dust won't always work, though. He'll attempt to use it again in May 1942 in the Battle of Gazala, utilizing spare aircraft engines on the back of trucks to create huge clouds. Commander of the British 8th Army Neil Ritchie will not be fooled, however, and holds his positions to fight the actual attacking force. The Axis also make effective use of the desert environment in their defensive positions. Officially called Ringstande, but known as Tobruks to the Allies, engineers build what are essentially concrete foxholes buried into the ground, right? They offer a 360-degree field of fire, and their low profile in the desert expanse makes them difficult to target. They are incredibly effective, and will even be used in later defense systems by the Axis in fighting in Europe. Minefields are also employed defensively by both sides as a means of strategic denial of otherwise open ground. This work is mostly conducted on the Axis side by Italians, who the Germans perceive as superior to their own troops when it comes to physical labor in the desert heat. It's not really clear how the Italians feel about this. But concrete foxholes and Italian-dug minefields are little use against the developing British Special Forces. Right from the beginning of the campaign, British doctrine is focused on small, combined arms groups known as Jock columns, formed by Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Campbell in 1940. Jock columns are comprised of an artillery battery, supported by a company of infantry, 3 anti-tank guns, and 3 Bofors anti-aircraft guns. Initially, they are effective at taking out unmotorized Italian forces, even when outnumbered, because of the relatively concentrated firepower contained within each Jock column. So they're pretty good at harassing the enemy or attacking their rear areas. But they're not so effective against major offensives or operating offensively themselves. This becomes painfully obvious after the failure of Operation Battle Axe, when over-reliance on Jock columns means the British split up their armor rather than use them as a concentrated force, leading to significant losses. But the idea of a small improvised force is still well suited to the desert when used effectively, and Ralph Alger Bagnold is the man to perfect it. An explorer and a member of the Signal Company who spent the interwar years charting the Egyptian desert, Bagnold has pioneered the use of motorized vehicles in such conditions. When Italy declares war on Britain, Bagnold goes to Wavell and talks to him about putting his desert expertise to use in the campaign. He convinces a skeptical Wavell about the feasibility of a specially trained reconnaissance and raiding unit acting as pirates of the desert, okay? Within 6 weeks, the Long Range Desert Patrol, destined to be renamed the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, is created. By September 1940, the LRDG has 3 patrols conducting operations deep inside enemy territory. It carries out a variety of missions, including reconnaissance, distribution of propaganda among local populations, and later, support for SAS operations. Their patrols are structured to be self-contained, with fuel for 1,500 miles and enough provisions and supplies to last in the field for weeks at a time. This enables them to strike at enemy garrisons hundreds of miles apart, even on the same day, all while addressing the mapping and recon deficiencies in the British arsenal. Between December 1940 and April 1943, there will always be at least one patrol behind enemy lines, and their knowledge of the desert is such that they sometimes guide SAS units and other special agents through it. So there you have some insight into how both armies deal with the harsh desert environment in the North Africa campaign. But of course, the desert isn't just a homogeneous flat expanse, but rather a dynamic and hostile environment alternating between hard, dry, chalky ground and treacherous seas of sand. Perhaps the 2 most decisive environmental lessons learned and put into practice by both sides during this campaign are, first, the importance of motorized mobility and the consequent demands on supply and logistics, and second, the importance of misdirection and deception rather than concealment. If you'd like to learn about the tanks of the North Africa campaign, then check out this video that Chieftain did with us right here, any minute now. you can click on it right there, right, but not yet. But soon, okay? But join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com so we can continue to make this show for however many years it takes for this crazy mixed up war to end. Do not forget to subscribe. I will see you next time.